Hey friends, picture London at midnight, fog rolling through gaslit streets, the city silent except for secrets behind lace curtains. A preacher preaches purity by day and sins by night. A wife prays for freedom she can't name. And in the empire's heart, doctors, poets and queens hide passions the world wasn't ready to see. Because in the Victorian age, repression was power and desire was rebellion. So before we begin, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy uncovering the forbidden, the beautiful, and the deeply human side of history. Now, light a candle and step with me into the shadows of Victorian England. Let's begin. Victorian England was an empire of contradictions. Outwardly, it was a world draped in lace and manners, a society that prized modesty, chastity, and moral superiority. Yet beneath its polished veneer lay an anxious, trembling obsession with sex. The 19th century, stretching across Queen Victoria's long reign from 1837 to 1901, became the laboratory in which the Western world's modern ideas of sexuality were invented, not through freedom, but through fear. To understand the Victorian sexual world, one must first understand its theology of restraint. Morality was not simply a private virtue, it was a public creed. The home was to be the sanctuary of purity, guarded by the angelic figure of the wife. Queen Victoria herself embodied this myth. Her devotion to Prince Albert, her 9 children, and her image of domestic serenity were relentlessly publicized. Paintings, pamphlets, and etiquette manuals held her up as the model of womanhood, chaste, dutiful, and devoted to family. But this image was as much propaganda as truth. It concealed a world of anxiety about what might happen if desire were ever allowed to escape its corset. Sex, in Victorian thought, was both essential and dangerous. The period's moralists saw it as a biological necessity for procreation, yet a moral hazard if pursued for pleasure. This tension shaped everything from medicine to architecture. Women's clothing, layered and cinched, symbolized the ideal of modest concealment. Drawing room furniture was draped in fabric to cover the limbs of tables and chairs, lest even their curves stir unseemly imagination. Language itself was scrubbed of suggestion. The word leg was often replaced by limb in polite conversation. This was not prudery for its own sake, but part of a vast cultural project, an effort to contain the chaotic force of human desire within the strict lines of civility and control. Yet repression breeds fascination. The very culture that condemned open discussion of sex simultaneously produced a flood of erotic literature and clandestine curiosities. Publishers like William Dugdale and John Camden Hotten made fortunes smuggling pornographic books through London's alleys. In a city that boasted over 80,000 prostitutes at mid-century, the rhetoric of chastity served as both moral shield and secret invitation. The respectable gentleman, sermonizing against vice, was often the same man found visiting the brothels of Whitechapel or the music halls of Soho. Victorian moral codes were sustained not only by religion, but also by science. Doctors warned that excessive desire, particularly among women, could lead to hysteria, madness, or sterility. The clergyman and the physician stood side by side as guardians of morality, diagnosing lust as illness and purity as health. The human body became a moral battlefield, sin and virtue mapped onto skin, nerves, and organs. For women, the social cost of this ideology was immense. The cult of domesticity cast them as moral arbiters of the household, yet denied them agency over their own bodies. Sexual ignorance was a mark of virtue. A well-bred young lady was not supposed to understand how children were conceived until after marriage. Guides such as The Young Woman's Book or Sarah Stickney Ellis, The Women of England, instructed women that their highest calling was self-sacrifice, to be the moral mirror by which men might cleanse themselves of baser instincts. Men, conversely, were told that their appetites were natural, even necessary, but must be managed. Middle-class masculinity was built on self-discipline. A man who indulged in prostitutes or self-abuse was warned of dire consequences, blindness, impotence, or even death. Thus, an entire generation grew up haunted by guilt over their own bodies, locked in an internal battle between instinct and moral panic. Publicly, the Victorians celebrated progress, railways, telegraphs, empire, yet their private lives remained dominated by secrecy. Letters and diaries reveal an astonishing double life. In the privacy of correspondence, men and women discussed passions that could never be voiced aloud. In medical journals, doctors recorded cases of nymphomania and moral insanity, terms often applied to women who merely expressed sexual curiosity. Meanwhile, government records, court transcripts, and newspapers overflowed with stories of adultery, seduction, and scandal. No figure embodied the era's tension between purity and desire more than Queen Victoria herself. Far from the prudish caricature history later made of her, Victoria adored physical affection. Her surviving letters to Prince Albert pulse with passion and possessiveness. "How intensely I love you," she wrote in 1840, the morning after their wedding night, "and how happy I am to be called by your name." But once widowed, she reversed roles, becoming the national matron of restraint, enforcing her own grief as the new standard of virtue. Her private fervor became the public model of repression. This transformation defined Victorian sexual culture, an endless oscillation between indulgence and denial, secrecy and sermon. Did its opposite. The etiquette manuals that preached modesty also heightened awareness of temptation. The medical treatises that condemned desire made it a subject of scientific curiosity. Even pornography flourished under the very censorship that sought to destroy it. The more Victorians tried to silence sex, the louder its echoes became. In this tension lay the birth of modern hypocrisy, the separation between public morality and private behavior that still haunts Western society. The Victorians built an empire on this moral foundation. Men conquering the world in the name of virtue, women confined to the parlour in the name of purity, and desire surviving between them like a ghost no one could name. Hey friends, picture London at midnight, fog rolling through gaslit streets, the city silent except for secrets behind lace curtains. A preacher preaches purity by day and sins by night. A wife prays for freedom she can't name, and in the empire's heart, doctors, poets, and queens hide passions the world wasn't ready to see, because in the Victorian age, repression was power, and desire was rebellion. So before we begin, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy uncovering the forbidden, the beautiful, and the deeply human side of history. Now, light a candle, and step with me into the shadows of Victorian England. Let's begin. Victorian England was an empire of contradictions. Outwardly, it was a world draped in lace and manners, a society that prized modesty, chastity, and moral superiority. Yet beneath its polished veneer lay an anxious, trembling obsession with sex. The 19th century, stretching across Queen Victoria's long reign from 1837 to 1901, became the laboratory in which the Western world's modern ideas of sexuality were invented, not through freedom, but through fear. To understand the Victorian sexual world, one must first understand its theology of restraint. Morality was not simply a private virtue, it was a public creed. The home was to be the sanctuary of purity, guarded by the angelic figure of the wife. Queen Victoria herself embodied this myth. Her devotion to Prince Albert, her 9 children, and her image of domestic serenity were relentlessly publicized. Paintings, pamphlets, and etiquette manuals held her up as the model of womanhood, chaste, dutiful, and devoted to family. But this image was as much propaganda as truth. It concealed a world of anxiety about what might happen if desire were ever allowed to escape its corset. Sex, in Victorian thought, was both essential and dangerous. The period's moralists saw it as a biological necessity for procreation, yet a moral hazard if pursued for pleasure. This tension shaped everything from medicine to architecture. Women's clothing, layered and cinched, symbolized the ideal of modest concealment. Drawing room furniture was draped in fabric to cover the limbs of tables and chairs, lest even their curves stir unseemly imagination. Language itself was scrubbed of suggestion. The word leg was often replaced by limb in polite conversation. This was not prudery for its own sake, but part of a vast cultural project, an effort to contain the chaotic force of human desire within the strict lines of civility and control. Yet repression breeds fascination. The very culture that condemned open discussion of sex simultaneously produced a flood of erotic literature and clandestine curiosities. Publishers like William Dugdale and John Camden Hotten made fortunes smuggling pornographic books through London's alleys. In a city that boasted over 80,000 prostitutes at mid-century, the rhetoric of chastity served as both moral shield and secret invitation. The respectable gentleman, sermonizing against vice, was often the same man found visiting the brothels of Whitechapel or the music halls of Soho. Victorian moral codes were sustained not only by religion, but also by science. Doctors warned that excessive desire, particularly among women, could lead to hysteria, madness, or sterility. The clergyman and the physician stood side by side as guardians of morality, diagnosing lust as illness and purity as health. The human body became a moral battlefield, sin and virtue mapped onto skin, nerves, and organs. For women, the social cost of this ideology was immense. The cult of domesticity cast them as moral arbiters of the household, yet denied them agency over their own bodies. Sexual ignorance was a mark of virtue. A well-bred young lady was not supposed to understand how children were conceived until after marriage. Guides such as The Young Woman's Book or Sarah Stickney Ellis, the women of England instructed women that their highest calling was self-sacrifice, to be the moral mirror by which men might cleanse themselves of baser instincts. Men, conversely, were told that their appetites were natural, even necessary, but must be managed. Middle-class masculinity was built on self-discipline. A man who indulged in prostitutes or self-abuse was warned of dire consequences, blindness, impotence, or even death. Thus, an entire generation grew up haunted by guilt over their own bodies, locked in an internal battle between instinct and moral panic. Publicly, the Victorians celebrated progress, railways, telegraphs, empire, yet their private lives remained dominated by secrecy. Letters and diaries reveal an astonishing double life. In the privacy of correspondence, men and women discussed passions that could never be voiced aloud. In medical journals, doctors recorded cases of nymphomania and moral insanity, terms often applied to women who merely expressed sexual curiosity. Meanwhile, government records, court transcripts, and newspapers overflowed with stories of adultery, seduction, and scandal. No figure embodied the era's tension between purity and desire more than Queen Victoria herself. Far from the prudish caricature history later made of her, Victoria adored physical affection. Her surviving letters to Prince Albert pulse with passion and possessiveness. "How intensely I love you," she wrote in 1840, the morning after their wedding night, "and how happy I am to be called by your name." But once widowed, she reversed roles, becoming the national matron of restraint, enforcing her own grief as the new standard of virtue. Her private fervor became the public model of repression. This transformation defined Victorian sexual culture, an endless oscillation between indulgence and denial, secrecy and sermon. Did its opposite. The etiquette manuals that preached modesty also heightened awareness of temptation. The medical treatises that condemned desire made it a subject of scientific curiosity. Even pornography flourished under the very censorship that sought to destroy it. The more Victorians tried to silence sex, the louder its echoes became. In this tension lay the birth of modern hypocrisy, the separation between public morality and private behavior that still haunts Western society. The Victorians built an empire on this moral foundation. Men conquering the world in the name of virtue, women confined to the parlour in the name of purity, and desire surviving between them like a ghost no one could name. By the mid-19th century, the pulpit was no longer the only seat of moral authority in England. Medicine, newly professionalized and clothed in the prestige of science, had begun to take the pulpit's place. The physician became a secular priest of the body, interpreting not sin but symptoms, and in doing so redefined the language of morality in physiological terms. Lust, once a matter of the soul, was now an ailment of the nerves. And of all the fears that haunted Victorian bedrooms, none was greater than the terror of self-abuse. The idea that masturbation could destroy the body did not originate with the Victorians, but they gave it its most elaborate form. 18th century pamphlets like Onania had already warned that solitary vice would cause blindness, consumption, and death. But the Industrial Revolution gave new urgency to such fears. In an age obsessed with productivity, any wasted seed was imagined as a loss to both the individual and the nation. Semen, doctors argued, was not merely reproductive fluid. It was the essence of life itself, a precious store of energy that, if squandered, would sap a man's strength, intellect, and moral fibre. By the 1830s and 1840s, medical treatises on the subject formed a thriving genre. Works such as Samuel Auguste Tissot's Onanism and J.H. Kellogg's Plain Facts for Old and Young, later in the century, combined pseudo-science with moral panic. Advertisements for restorative tonics, moral pills, and even mechanical restraints filled the pages of newspapers. Quack doctors toured provincial towns diagnosing seminal weakness in any nervous young man willing to pay for a cure. Many of these doctors were frauds, but their message reflected genuine cultural anxiety that modern civilization, with its urban isolation and moral temptations, was breeding a generation of degenerates undone by pleasure. Schools became the front line of this battle. Headmasters and physicians issued pamphlets warning parents to watch for signs of self-pollution in their children: fatigue, pallor, melancholy, or distraction in class. Boys were sometimes fitted with anti-masturbation devices made of leather or metal, designed to prick or confine the genitals. In hospitals, moral treatment included cold baths, bland diets, and in severe cases, circumcision or even castration. Girls, meanwhile, were subjected to similar controls under the diagnosis of hysteria. Doctors attributed hysteria to wandering wombs or overstimulation, prescribing bed rest, cold compresses, or marriage as cures. At the center of these practices was a profound misunderstanding of human physiology, but also something deeper, a moral unease with pleasure itself. To the Victorian mind, sexual desire was a force that threatened to undo the fragile order of family and class. The body had to be disciplined just as the factory and the empire were. The same moral logic that demanded punctual workers and obedient wives demanded restrained bodies. The self-abuser was not simply unhealthy. He was a rebel against the moral economy of the age. Yet the medical literature of the period also reveals hints of doubt. Not all physicians accepted the orthodox view. The French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot, for instance, began to question whether hysteria and sexual repression might themselves be symptoms of psychological conflict rather than moral failure. In England, figures like Henry Maudsley, though still steeped in moralism, admitted that sexual instincts were natural and ineradicable. But even as these cracks appeared, the old doctrines continued to shape public behavior. For women, the consequences of medical moralism were particularly severe. Victorian physicians routinely dismissed female desire as either non-existent or pathological. William Acton's claim that the majority of women are not troubled by sexual feelings of any kind became a medical axiom. Women who showed sexual appetite could be labeled hysterical or insane, leading to confinement in asylums. Case records from London's Bethlehem Hospital, Bedlam, and other institutions describe women committed for nymphomania, moral insanity, or unwomanly behavior, categories so vague they could encompass almost anything. Behind the scientific language lay a simple social truth. Women's sexuality, uncontrolled by marriage, was intolerable to the Victorian order. The medicalization of desire also reshaped men's sense of self. In treating sexuality as a finite resource to be rationed, doctors linked moral virtue to physical vigor. A man's potency became proof of his strength and self-control, but only when properly channeled through marriage and reproduction. This produced what historian Angus MacLaren has called the economy of semen, a system in which the moral worth of men was measured by their ability to conserve their bodily capital. Excessive passion signaled weakness. Restraint was power. The result was a generation of men raised to feel both proud of their virility and terrified of their bodies. Masturbation panic reached its apogee in the 1860s and 1870s. Medical journals published lurid case studies of patients supposedly ruined by self-abuse, their bodies wasted, their minds unhinged. These reports were often fabricated or exaggerated, yet they circulated widely. Even mainstream educators embraced the rhetoric. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, Britain's first woman physician, warned in her lectures that the vice of solitary indulgence poisons the springs of life. Moral reformers saw the same problem through a different lens. For them, self-control was the foundation of Christian virtue. Thus, science and religion, often opposed in other areas, found common cause in the policing of desire. Ironically, this campaign against sexuality helped to produce the very discourse it sought to suppress. By treating erotic behavior as a medical problem, the Victorians opened the way for modern sexology. Doctors began to collect data, classify behaviors, and theorize about perversions, a term first used in clinical context during this period. Desire was dragged out of the confessional and into the clinic. What had been sin became symptom. What had been vice became diagnosis. In this transformation lay a subtle but revolutionary shift. Once sexuality could be studied, it could also be questioned. If pleasure was merely a natural impulse, then perhaps its repression, not its expression, was the true danger. By the century's end, thinkers like Havelock Ellis and Sigmund Freud would invert the old hierarchy entirely, arguing that repression itself produced neurosis. But before this intellectual liberation could occur, an entire generation had already suffered under the weight of moral science. Behind the medical jargon and moral hysteria lay an unspoken truth about Victorian life, that desire, however disciplined, never disappeared. It seeped through every barrier, in the nervous tics of the schoolboy, the sleeplessness of the governess, the confessions of patients who could no longer bear their guilt. What the doctors called disease was, in fact, the struggle of the human body against an impossible ideal of purity. The masturbation panic was less about sin or sickness than about control, the attempt of a society, terrified of its own instincts, to make the private life of the body conform to the machinery of empire. If Victorian morality was a fortress of restraint, prostitution was the secret tunnel that ran beneath its walls. It was the trade everyone condemned, but no one could destroy, the social safety valve for a society that worshipped purity while denying passion. And by the 1860s, that trade had become one of the largest and most complex industries in Britain. The scale was staggering. London, the heart of the empire, was said to host as many as 80,000 prostitutes by mid-century, a ratio of 1 prostitute for every 12 adult men. Similar figures were reported for Liverpool, Manchester and Glasgow. These women came from every stratum of the working class: laundresses, seamstresses, domestic servants, factory hands. Most had been driven to the streets by poverty, seduction or abandonment. The average working life of a prostitute was said to be only 4 years, disease, alcoholism and violence claiming many before the age of 25. The Victorians called them fallen women, a term that implied moral descent but also allowed society to look away. The fallen woman was not merely a sinner, but a symbol. She carried the burden of collective guilt. Her suffering proved the virtue of others. She existed so that middle-class wives could believe in their own purity and reformers could campaign for redemption. Yet for all the sermons and charities devoted to rescuing her, few asked why she had fallen in the first place. The answer lay in the structure of Victorian society itself. Wages for women were often half those of men, and respectable employment was scarce. Domestic service, the largest employer of women, paid little and offered no security. A servant dismissed for pregnancy or rumor of impropriety had few choices but starvation or the street. The city's geography reinforced this cycle. In the East End, tenements and gin shops crowded together. In the West End, private clubs and houses of assignation catered to the wealthy. Poverty and privilege met nightly under the same fog. Reformers and journalists began to document this underworld with equal parts horror and fascination. Henry Mayhew's London Labour and the London Poor, and William Acton's Prostitution, considered in its moral, social and sanitary aspects, gave prostitution a new visibility. Acton, a physician, estimated that 1 woman in every 16 in London had engaged in prostitution at some point, yet he considered it a necessary evil, a safeguard for respectable households. "I am convinced," he wrote, "that prostitution, in one shape or another, is inevitable, and that attempts to extirpate it wholly must prove abortive." To modern ears this sounds cynical, but to Victorians it was logic. The double standard that excused male desire while condemning female transgression was not hypocrisy to them, it was moral order. Men were creatures of appetite, women were guardians of virtue. When a woman fell, she had transgressed not only religion, but nature. But the state's involvement made this ideology lethal. By the 1860s, Britain's growing military empire faced a crisis of venereal disease among soldiers and sailors. In garrison towns like Portsmouth, Plymouth and Aldershot, infection rates were crippling troop readiness. Instead of addressing male behaviour, Parliament targeted women. The Contagious Diseases Acts of 1864, 1866 and 1869 authorized police to detain any woman suspected of prostitution in these districts. Once arrested, she could be forcibly examined by a doctor, an invasive procedure performed with a speculum, and if found to have a venereal infection, she could be confined in a lock hospital for up to 3 months without trial. Refusal to submit meant imprisonment. The acts represented the first formal alliance of morality, medicine, and state power against women's autonomy. They were justified as public health measures, but their language betrayed their moral intent. The state's concern was not for the health of women, but for the convenience of men. As Josephine Butler, the reformer who would later lead the campaign for repeal, observed bitterly, "This legislation treats the man as a rational being, the woman as a creature without rights, an instrument for his service, a source of infection when inconvenient." To the establishment, the system worked. Infection rates among soldiers fell modestly. The public grew complacent. But the cost was immense. Women were harassed, assaulted and humiliated. Many committed suicide after arrest, unable to bear the stigma. For the poor, The acts turned mere suspicion into a death sentence. Then, in 1869, the resistance began. Josephine Butler, a clergyman's wife and devout Christian, took up the cause of the outcast woman. She founded the Ladies' National Association for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, traveling the country to speak against what she called state-sanctioned degradation. Butler's speeches electrified audiences. She exposed the hypocrisy of a society that claimed to protect morality while violating it through institutionalized assault. Her campaign united feminists, radicals, and religious dissenters. Together, they argued that true purity could not be coerced. The backlash was ferocious. Butler was denounced in Parliament, mocked in the press, and physically attacked by mobs. Respectable society accused her of indelicate speech, simply because she dared to utter words like disease, prostitution, and speculum in public. Yet her persistence shifted the national conscience. By the 1880s, even conservative newspapers admitted the acts had become a moral scandal. In 1886, after nearly 20 years of struggle, Parliament repealed them. The repeal marked more than a legislative victory. It was one of the earliest triumphs of feminist activism in modern Britain, a rare moment when moral reform aligned with human rights. It also revealed something profound about the Victorian psyche, that beneath its armor of respectability, the empire's moral order depended on the subjugation of women. The prostitute was not an aberration, but a necessity. A scapegoat who absorbed the contradictions of a society built on male dominance and female silence. After repeal, prostitution did not disappear. It adapted. The late Victorian period saw a shift from the open street trade to more hidden forms: private rooms, escort arrangements, even international trafficking. But the moral imagination of the age never recovered. The idea that the state could regulate sexuality in the name of virtue had been exposed as cruelty, and yet the tension endured. The moral crusaders who fought prostitution also condemned contraception, sexual education, and women's pleasure. The prostitute might be freed from police inspection, but the respectable wife remained bound by ignorance. In this contradiction, the next stage of the Victorian sexual story begins. The struggle over the body inside marriage itself, where love, law, and ownership collided. To the Victorians, marriage was not simply a union of hearts. It was a contract of property, morality, and power. In the eyes of the law, it defined not two individuals, but one household. A man as master and a woman as his dependent. If prostitution was the shadow economy of sex, marriage was its legal monopoly, sanctified by church, state, and custom alike. And for much of the 19th century, it was less a partnership than a form of ownership. Under English common law, a married woman ceased to exist as a separate legal person. This doctrine, called coverture, had ancient roots. Upon marriage, a woman's legal identity was covered by her husband's. She could not own property, sign contracts, sue or be sued, or even claim custody of her own children. William Blackstone, the 18th century jurist whose commentaries shaped Victorian jurisprudence, stated plainly, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended." This principle endured well into Queen Victoria's reign. The result was a paradox of moral logic. While society exalted women as angels of the home, it denied them the most basic autonomy within it. A respectable woman was expected to embody purity, submission, and devotion, qualities that made her morally superior but legally powerless. Her chastity was her value, her obedience, her virtue. In exchange, the husband was charged with protection and provision, roles that, in theory, ennobled him, but in practice gave him near total control. Behind closed doors, this power could turn brutal. Victorian law regarded a wife's body as her husband's lawful possession. Marital rape, though rarely named, was legally impossible. Consent was presumed permanent. A husband could not be guilty of violating his wife, for in the logic of coverture, her will was his. Courts occasionally intervened in cases of extreme cruelty, but the threshold for intervention was astonishingly high. In one 1862 case, a judge ruled that a man who beat his wife with moderation had acted within his marital rights. Wives seeking escape faced almost insurmountable barriers. Divorce in early Victorian Britain was a privilege reserved for the rich. Until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, divorce required a private act of Parliament, a process costing hundreds of pounds, effectively impossible for ordinary people. Even after 1857, the law remained lopsided. A husband could divorce his wife for adultery alone, while a wife had to prove adultery plus cruelty, desertion, or incest. The assumption was clear. Male infidelity was regrettable but natural. Female infidelity was catastrophic. The cultural machinery reinforced this hierarchy. Conduct books, sermons and magazines, such as the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine, taught women that submission was their highest calling. The ideal wife was pious, self-sacrificing. Sarah Stickney Ellis, the Women of England, instructed that a truly feminine woman never exerts her intellect for display. Her influence is moral, not mental. Charlotte Bronte, writing in private letters, called this ideal an iron cage of virtue. But not all women accepted their captivity quietly. By the 1850s and 1860s, early feminists, then called ladies of the woman question, began to challenge the legal foundation of marriage. Campaigners like Barbara Lee Smith Bodichon and Caroline Norton exposed the cruelty of coverture through their own lives. Norton, a writer and socialite, suffered a famously abusive marriage to MP George Norton. When she left him, he seized her earnings and barred her from seeing their children. Because the law considered them his property, she had no recourse. Her public campaign led to the Custody of Infants Act and the Matrimonial Causes Act, early but imperfect steps toward reform. For most women, however, reform came too slowly to touch daily life. Marriage manuals continued to teach that wifely duty included sexual submission. Once married, one 1860 guide declared, "A woman has placed her person under her husband's keeping." Refusal of intercourse could be cited as cruelty or grounds for annulment. Even the emerging field of medicine reinforced this logic. Doctors claimed that regular marital sex was essential to a woman's health, even as they warned that passion outside marriage was pathological. Thus, the wife's body became both a prescription and a prison, its rhythms regulated not by desire but by duty. The cult of domesticity turned these private inequalities into public virtue. The home was celebrated as the moral center of the nation, the angel in the house as its guardian. Poet Coventry Patmore's 1854 poem by that title immortalized the Victorian wife as a saint of submission, who by her sweet humility redeemed the man's coarser nature. This imagery saturated popular culture, from paintings by George Elgar Hicks to the sentimental fiction of Mrs. Craik. Yet even as society worshipped the angel, it feared her fall. Every sermon about purity implied the threat of pollution. Every ideal of obedience concealed the possibility of rebellion, and rebellion was coming. The late 19th century saw an explosion of debate over marriage, divorce, and women's rights. John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women argued that marriage under coverture was the last remnant of slavery. His wife, Harriet Taylor Mill, had already written that women's degradation is the foundation of the world's hypocrisy. Such words scandalized respectable readers, but they found eager audiences among reformers and radicals. Mill's arguments helped fuel the campaigns for the Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882, which finally allowed married women to own and control their own earnings and property. These changes did not immediately liberate women, but they cracked the facade of domestic perfection. For the first time, marriage could be seen not only as sacred duty, but as a social contract, one that could be contested, even refused. In literature, this shift erupted in the figure of the new woman, educated, independent, and unwilling to accept servitude. Writers like George Egerton, Olive Schreiner, and Mona Caird explored the emotional cost of marriage and the hunger for freedom. Caird's 1888 essay Marriage caused a national uproar when she asked, "Is marriage a failure?" Newspapers invited readers to respond, and thousands did, some with outrage, others with relief. By century's end, the Victorian ideal of marriage as moral order was beginning to crumble. Women had begun to speak, to write, and to resist. Yet the shadows of the old system lingered. Sexual ignorance remained widespread. Marital rape remained unrecognized in law. Even as the home became a site of affection and companionship for some, for others it remained a gilded cage, a place where love was expected but autonomy was forbidden. The story of Victorian marriage is thus not only one of oppression, but of awakening. Through the cracks in the doctrine of obedience, a new consciousness emerged. The idea that desire could be mutual, that partnership could replace possession. But before that vision could take hold, the Victorians would face a new challenge, the rise of modern science and psychiatry, which would once again claim authority over the mysteries of sex. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Victorian world was changing faster than any generation before it. Steam, electricity, photography, and telegraphy had compressed space and time. Darwin's theory of evolution had shaken faith in divine creation, and as science reached into every corner of nature, it inevitably turned its gaze upon the most private frontier of all, human desire. The Victorians, who had spent a century trying to silence sex, now sought to understand it. But understanding, in their hands, meant classification, diagnosis, and control. The rise of sexology, the scientific study of sex, was one of the strangest byproducts of the era's moral repression. Because sex was unspeakable in polite society, it became an irresistible subject for those on the edges of medicine, law, and anthropology. Doctors, criminologists, and moral philosophers began to catalogue behaviours once dismissed as sins or crimes, giving them new names and theories. In doing so, they created not only a science of sexuality, but the modern idea of sexual identity itself. The roots of this transformation lay partly in continental Europe. In France, Jean-Martin Charcot's studies of hysteria at the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris revealed that many patients' nervous symptoms were linked to emotional or sexual trauma. In Germany, Richard von Krafft-Ebing's monumental Psychopathia Sexualis gathered hundreds of case studies of what he called perversions, acts and desires ranging from same-sex attraction to fetishism, voyeurism, and sadomasochism. Krafft-Ebing's aim was not to celebrate these variations, but to classify them, much as a naturalist might catalogue species. Yet his work had an unintended consequence. By naming these behaviors, he gave them existence, and those who practiced them, an identity. In Britain, similar inquiries emerged in more cautious tones. The physician, Henry Havelock Ellis, influenced by both continental science and feminist thought, sought to understand sexuality not as disease, but as a fundamental aspect of human nature. His multi-volume studies in the psychology of sex became one of the most influential works of the modern era. Ellis challenged the prevailing view that women were passionless and men insatiable. He wrote that sexual impulse in woman is strong, though usually repressed, and that its suppression produced neurosis and unhappiness. For this, he was denounced as immoral, and several of his books were banned in Britain under the Obscene Publications Act. Yet Ellis' careful clinical tone distinguished him from sensationalism. He argued that there is no sin in nature, only misunderstanding, a radical statement in a world still ruled by Victorian prudery. Sexology's emergence was inseparable from the era's broader obsession with classification. The 19th century had witnessed the rise of phrenology, anthropology, and criminology, all sciences that sought to map human difference through measurement and taxonomy. The human body became a site of inscription. Skulls, faces, and genitals were measured for signs of deviance or virtue. Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso claimed that prostitutes could be identified by abnormally developed jaws and small crania. British doctors published charts comparing the genitalia of civilized and savage races. The same empire that mapped its colonies began to map the body itself. But when sexologists like Karl Heinrich Ulrichs in Germany and later Ellis in Britain began to describe sexual inversion as an inborn condition, they transformed what had been sin into a category of personhood. Ulrichs, himself homosexual, argued that such individuals were a third sex, possessing a male body and a female soul. Though his language reflected Victorian gender assumptions, his theory was revolutionary. For the first time, men and women who loved their own sex could recognize themselves not as criminals, but as a distinct minority, albeit one still stigmatized by law and medicine. This shift from moral condemnation to medical classification did not immediately liberate anyone. Homosexuality remained a criminal offence in Britain under the 1885 Labouchere Amendment, which made gross indecency between men punishable by imprisonment. It was this law that would later ensnare Oscar Wilde, whose 1895 trial became a spectacle of public hypocrisy. Prosecutors used Wilde's own letters and wit against him, painting him as both decadent artist and moral contagion. His conviction and 2-year sentence in Reading jail marked the high watermark of Victorian repression, the moment when science, morality, and law conspired to punish the very individuality they had helped define. Yet the same society that condemned Wilde read his works with fascination. The picture of Dorian Gray, with its coded homoeroticism and moral irony, captured the tension between desire and decorum better than any scientific text. Its message, that repression corrupts more deeply than indulgence, was a truth the Victorians could not admit but could not ignore. While sexologists measured and classified, the psychiatrists of the age began to probe the mind itself. The new discipline of psychology, emerging from philosophy and neurology, sought to uncover the hidden motives of human behavior. Figures like Pierre Janet and later Sigmund Freud proposed that sexuality was central to the unconscious, that repression rather than lust itself was the true source of neurosis. Though Freud's major works would come after Victoria's death, his ideas were rooted in the contradictions of her age. In the Victorian household, with its locked bedrooms, silent desires, and moral surveillance, repression was not theory, but daily life. The medicalization of desire produced both liberation and new forms of control. On one hand, it replaced moral condemnation with the language of pathology, opening the possibility of understanding. On the other, it subjected the body and the mind to institutional power. Hospitals, asylums, and laboratories replaced the church confessional. The sinner became the patient, the priest became the doctor. The shame remained, only now cloaked in clinical detachment. The body, once ruled by God, was now ruled by science. Yet within this system, new voices began to whisper. Writers, reformers, and intellectuals started to question whether the diseases catalogued by Krafft-Ebing and his peers were diseases at all. Havelock Ellis, Edward Carpenter, and others in the sex reform movement argued that love and desire, in all their variations, were natural expressions of life. Their writings, circulated privately, inspired an early sexual counterculture, one that would later influence the suffragists, pacifists, and bohemian artists of the early 20th century. Thus, out of the same Victorian soil that had produced moral panic and medical repression, a new idea was germinating, that sexuality could be studied, understood, and perhaps even celebrated. The science of sin was becoming the psychology of self. But before this transformation could fully unfold, the empire would look beyond itself, to its colonies, where erotic curiosity, racial fantasy, and power intertwined in new and troubling ways. By the twilight years of the 19th century, London had become a city of double lives. By day, it was the beating heart of empire, disciplined, industrious, and self-assured. By night, it was a labyrinth of anonymity, a place where identity itself could be shed like a coat. This was the London of gaslight and fog, of private clubs and secret lodgings, where those who defied the moral order found ways to exist in the shadows. It was here, amid the swirl of hypocrisy and curiosity, police records, court transcripts, and newspaper exposés described networks of molly houses, flagellation clubs, and cross-dressing gatherings that operated discreetly but persistently. Referring to those who dressed and behaved in ways society deemed inverted, these places were not mere dens of vice, but social refuges, spaces where men and women could experiment with identity long before the language of sexuality or gender existed to describe them. Cross-dressing was one of the most visible and controversial of these practices. Men who appeared in public in women's clothing risked arrest under laws against indecency or impersonation. Women who dressed as men often faced both fascination and condemnation, yet the practice flourished. For women, male attire offered freedom of movement and access to work. For men, female dress offered a rare release from the constraints of masculinity. Police files from the Metropolitan Archives record dozens of arrests of men in dresses, many discovered not in brothels, but in private parties or theatres. In 1870, the Illustrated Police News reported the sensational case of Stella and Fanny, two men apprehended while attending a ball in drag at a Chelsea tavern. They were paraded before the court as monsters of effeminacy, yet the photographs taken at their trial reveal not shame, but composure. Theatrical cross-dressing blurred the boundaries further. The Victorian stage was full of breeches roles, where actresses played male characters, often to titillate audiences with glimpses of their legs. At the same time, the all-male tradition of Shakespearean theatre persisted in some venues, making gender fluidity both a source of art and anxiety. Pantomime, immensely popular in the 1800s, turned gender play into mainstream entertainment. Principal boys were always women, and dames were always men. Behind the laughter lay the truth that the Victorians could never quite suppress, that identity was as much performance as biology. Fetishism, too, occupied a peculiar space between secrecy and spectacle. While medical men like Krafft Ebing pathologized it as a perversion, Victorian culture was saturated with fetishistic imagery. Corsets, gloves, boots, and hair, objects charged with erotic symbolism, appeared constantly in art and fashion. The tight-laced waist, the gloved hand, the polished boot were emblems of refinement and desire alike. Artists such as Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Edward Burne-Jones painted women with languid gazes and exaggerated physical detail, turning piety into sensuality. Meanwhile, the private collectors of London's elite amassed cabinets of erotic curiosities, antique figurines, French photographs, Orientalist paintings. In this world, fetishism was not only a medical curiosity, but a cultural language, one that revealed the Victorians' obsession with discipline and display. Perhaps no fetish was more telling than that of flagellation. The cane and the whip, symbols of authority in school, army, and empire, reappeared in the bedroom. Victorian pornography, often masquerading as moral instruction or confessions, featured scenes of whipping, punishment, and submission. Publishers like William Dugdale specialized in such works, which circulated clandestinely among the upper classes. Even respectable literature was not immune. When the anonymous novel My Secret Life began circulating in the 1880s, to modern readers, these obsessions might seem pathological, but they reflected a deeper truth about Victorian society. Power and desire were intertwined. The same culture that ruled colonies, children, and women through discipline found erotic charge in submission and control. The late Victorian period also saw the rise of coded communities, networks bound by secrecy and recognition. Members of these circles used signals, phrases, and gestures to identify one another in public. Some carried specific flowers. The green carnation, made famous by Oscar Wilde and his followers, became a symbol of male-male attraction. In letters and diaries, correspondents used euphemisms like "my special friend" or "one of the aesthetic set" to describe relationships that could not be named. Language became camouflage, irony became confession. The very repression that criminalized desire forced it to become ingenious. Surveillance was constant. The police employed moral inspectors to patrol known gathering places. Private detectives were hired by families to expose scandal. Yet these attempts at control often produced the opposite result. By defining deviance, they made it visible. Trials, newspaper reports, and medical case studies spread awareness of practices that might otherwise have remained unknown. The very act of persecution gave hidden identities a strange, dangerous form of publicity. One of the most striking examples came in 1889 with the scandal surrounding Ernest Bolton and Frederick Park, known to the press as Stella and Fanny. Both were actors who performed publicly in women's clothing and privately maintained relationships with men of standing. Arrested and tried for conspiracy to commit sodomy, they became symbols of both ridicule and fascination. The trial, widely reported, revealed the existence of a subculture that many Victorians had only suspected. The jury, however, acquitted them, partly because no direct evidence of sexual acts was found, and partly because even the court could not fully define what crime had been committed. Their acquittal, celebrated quietly by sympathizers, hinted that the moral certainties of the age were beginning to fray. Behind all these phenomena, the cross-dressers, the fetishists, the secret societies, lay a profound cultural contradiction. The Victorian world was obsessed with boundaries, male and female, moral and immoral, civilized and savage. Yet its fascination with transgression betrayed an awareness that those boundaries were fragile. Every act of disguise, every forbidden pleasure exposed the artificiality of the categories that society defended so fiercely. In the mirror of its own repression, the empire glimpsed its true face, one that was not pure, but plural. These secret communities were not simply curiosities of decadence. They were early expressions of identity. In the hidden rooms of London and Paris, people began to imagine lives beyond the binaries of their age. They were not yet gay, transgender, or kinky in the modern sense. Such words did not exist. But they were already living the realities those words would later describe. Their existence proved that even in an era of moral ironclads, the human spirit found ways to move, to transform, to resist. As the century drew to a close, Another frontier beckoned, one that would expose the Victorian obsession with race, empire, and exotic desire. For if the British were intent on disciplining passion at home, abroad they found themselves entangled in fantasies of domination and forbidden allure, the erotic shadow of empire itself. If the home was the sanctum of Victorian virtue, the empire was its laboratory of contradiction. Abroad, Britons preached Christian morality while indulging in fantasies of conquest that were as erotic as they were political. In India, Africa, the Caribbean, and the South Pacific, the British carried not only their commerce and armies, but also their anxieties about sex, race, and civilization. What they found, and imagined, abroad both unsettled and excited them. The colonies became mirrors in which Victorians projected the desires they denied themselves. The 19th century empire was built on discipline, of bodies, of labor, of desire. At home, self-control was the mark of civilization. Abroad, it became the justification for domination. The British defined themselves as morally superior to the peoples they ruled, describing native societies as licentious, childlike, or barbarous. Missionaries wrote lurid accounts of heathen practices, from polygamy to temple prostitution, that both horrified and fascinated readers back home. Yet these reports, while meant to confirm European virtue, often revealed a covert envy. The savage body was imagined as freer, more sensual, less burdened by restraint, everything the Victorian body was not. Nowhere was this ambivalence more visible than in British India. The Raj presented itself as a bastion of moral order, but colonial life was saturated with sexual tension. British men, far from home and often unmarried, relied on native women for companionship, service, and desire. The figure of the bibi, an Indian concubine or domestic partner, became both common and scandalous. Early in the century, such relationships were tacitly accepted. Many Anglo-Indian families traced mixed ancestry to them. But as Victorian morality hardened in the mid-1800s, these unions came to be seen as threats to racial and moral purity. New laws and social pressures drove them underground, and Eurasians, the mixed-race children of these liaisons, became objects of discrimination. The British moral code, designed to separate civilization from savagery, began to turn upon itself. Colonial administrators cloaked their desires in paternalism. Memoirs and letters from officers described native women with a mix of admiration and condescension, as voluptuous, innocent, submissive. Eroticism was disguised as ethnography. Photography, a new technology of the empire, played a key role. Anthropological collections like those of the Archaeological Survey of India or the Royal Anthropological Institute included thousands of nude or semi-nude portraits of colonized subjects classified as racial types. Ostensibly scientific, these images satisfied a voyeurism that could not be admitted at home. The colonial gaze turned the human body into a specimen, object of study, symbol of dominance, and source of forbidden pleasure. The empire's fascination with the erotic other extended far beyond India. In Africa, travelers' accounts like those of explorer Sir Richard Burton mingled ethnography with fantasy. Burton, who translated the Arabian Nights and the Kama Sutra, defended sexual curiosity as scientific inquiry, yet his work was banned in England for obscenity. His writings bridged the gap between Victorian scholarship and sensual imagination, suggesting that the boundaries between the two were more porous than moralists dared admit. In the Pacific, artists and sailors circulated tales of Tahitian freedom, perpetuating Rousseau's myth of the noble savage, uncorrupted by civilization. These stories fueled a steady demand for exoticism in British art and literature, from paintings of odalisques to novels like H. Rider Haggard's She, 1887, in which an immortal African queen embodies both irresistible desire and mortal danger. Such fantasies served an ideological purpose. By depicting colonized peoples as hypersexual or primitive, the British justified their rule as moral guardianship. Empire became a civilizing mission not only of government, but of the flesh. The British man was cast as the rational, restrained figure rescuing the world from its passions. Yet the imagery of conquest itself was deeply erotic. Political cartoons, adventure novels, and even missionary propaganda depicted Britain as a masculine force subduing feminized lands. This sexual geography of empire turned power into desire, possession into pleasure. It was, as historian Anne McClintock later observed, imperial pornography disguised as moral pedagogy. The contradictions ran deep within the imperial household itself. European women in the colonies were expected to uphold the moral standards of home, to serve as models of purity amid temptation. Yet their presence intensified racial boundaries. British wives who arrived in India or Africa often demanded segregation from native servants and women, reinforcing the idea that white femininity must be protected from contamination. The purity of the Englishwoman became the symbol of imperial legitimacy. When Indian rebels in the 1857 Mutiny were rumoured, often falsely, to have assaulted British women, the press erupted in outrage. These tales of violated innocence justified brutal reprisals and hardened racial hierarchies. The body of the white woman became a political metaphor, her virtue equated with the honor of the empire itself. Meanwhile, the empire exported its sexual anxieties back home. Colonial experiences filled British newspapers, museums, and novels with a steady flow of exotic imagery: dusky dancers, harems, jungle queens. While moralists condemned such depictions, artists and readers devoured them. Painters like John Frederick Lewis and Frederick Leighton portrayed Eastern women reclining in silks, veiled yet exposed, embodying a fantasy of passive sensuality. These images allowed Victorians to explore desire under the cover of culture. By labeling the erotic as foreign, they could consume it without guilt. But the exchange worked both ways. Just as Britain imagined the colonies as spaces of temptation, colonized peoples observed and sometimes mimicked the moral theatre of their rulers. Indian reformers like Rammohun Roy and Pandita Ramabai adopted the language of Victorian virtue to argue for women's education and social reform, turning the empire's moral rhetoric against itself. In this sense, the empire was not merely a site of exploitation, but of hybridization, a place where sexual and moral codes collided, merged, and mutated. By the turn of the century, the contradictions of empire were impossible to ignore. Missionaries condemned native customs, while colonial officers kept concubines. Artists painted the sensual East, while politicians preached restraint. And as Britain's global power reached its zenith, its moral confidence began to falter. The empire that had claimed to civilize the world could no longer control the fantasies it had unleashed. The exotic became the erotic, the moral mission became a masquerade. In the next and penultimate phase of the Victorian sexual story, those contradictions returned home, embodied by reformers, radicals, and early feminists who sought to dismantle the hypocrisies of purity and possession. They would turn the language of morality against its masters, and in doing so, ignite the first sparks of the modern sexual revolution. By the final decades of the 19th century, the fortress of Victorian morality had begun to crack. Industrial wealth had transformed cities, education had reached new classes, and the empire's contradictions had eroded faith in its moral supremacy. At the same time, a chorus of reformers, women's rights advocates, socialists, doctors, and writers began to question the codes that governed sex, marriage, and morality. They were not yet modern libertarians, but they were the first to insist that the repression of desire was neither divine nor natural. It was political. These early sexual radicals came from diverse corners of society. Some were physicians appalled by the ignorance and suffering produced by moral censorship. Others were feminists who recognized that sexual control was the foundation of women's subordination. Still others were spiritualists and freethinkers who saw erotic freedom as part of human evolution. What united them was the conviction that truth about the body, love, and pleasure could no longer be silenced by hypocrisy. The women's movement of the 1860s and 1870s, born in campaigns for education and property rights, soon turned toward the question of sexual autonomy. Josephine Butler's crusade against the Contagious Diseases Acts had already exposed the gendered cruelty of state morality. Younger activists, such as Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy, Mona Caird, and Annie Besant carried that challenge further, demanding not only protection, but freedom. Besant, a fiery orator and former Anglican wife, became one of the most controversial figures of her time. After leaving her husband and the church, she joined the secularist movement led by Charles Bradlaugh. In 1877, they republished an American pamphlet, The Fruits of Philosophy, which advocated birth control, an act that led to their prosecution under obscenity laws. The Bradlaugh-Besant trial electrified Britain. Besant defended herself with eloquence, arguing that no law that makes ignorance a virtue can be moral. Though convicted, she won public sympathy and became a symbol of courage for women seeking control over their bodies. Her advocacy introduced the phrase voluntary motherhood, the radical idea that women had the right to choose when and whether to bear children. The issue of contraception, or neo-Malthusianism, divided reformers. Some moralists accused birth control advocates of encouraging promiscuity. Others saw it as the key to female emancipation and working-class prosperity. Public debates filled lecture halls, while pamphlets circulated under plain covers. For the first time, reproduction was discussed as a matter of rights rather than destiny. The language of family limitation would later evolve into the modern vocabulary of reproductive freedom. While feminists fought the law, physicians quietly waged war against ignorance. The medical profession, long complicit in sexual repression, began to fracture. Progressive doctors like Dr. Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, Britain's first licensed female physician, and Dr. Marie Stopes, a later successor, argued that sexual health was inseparable from moral health. Even within the male establishment, dissent grew. Dr. George Drysdale's Elements of Social Science, a clandestine bestseller, linked sexual repression to disease and social misery. Drysdale insisted that sexual pleasure was a natural function, and that denying it bred prostitution and hypocrisy. Though banned as obscene, his book circulated among radicals, influencing generations of reformers. Havelock Ellis, whose studies in the psychology of sex had already redefined desire in scientific terms, joined these campaigns in the 1890s. That shame and secrecy were the true enemies of morality. Ellis' work on sexual inversion, homosexuality, treated same-sex love not as a vice but as a natural variation. His insistence that there is no such thing as a normal sexuality quietly undermined the entire edifice of Victorian purity. Though ostracized by colleagues, Ellis became the bridge between the old moral order and the emerging psychology of liberation. Parallel to medical reform grew a small but passionate free-love movement rooted in radical Christianity, socialism, and the philosophy of personal freedom. Its adherents, often dismissed by the press as eccentrics or immoralists, rejected marriage as a form of economic bondage. Writers such as Edward Carpenter, a poet and socialist influenced by Walt Whitman, celebrated the spiritual unity of love unbound by law. In essays like Love's Coming of Age, Carpenter argued that affection between equals, regardless of gender, was the foundation of social progress. He foresaw a world where partnership replaced property, tenderness replaced tyranny. Other radicals, including Victoria Woodhull in the United States and George Bernard Shaw in Britain, adopted similar language. Woodhull's declaration that sexual freedom means moral responsibility shocked polite society, but resonated with those who saw marriage as legalized servitude. Shaw, through his plays and public debates, mocked the prudery of his time. In Mrs. Warren's Profession, he portrayed prostitution as an economic system rather than a sin, forcing audiences to confront the complicity of capitalism in moral corruption. These challenges provoked fierce backlash. Conservative newspapers accused reformers of undermining the family and promoting vice. The National Vigilance Association, founded in 1885, campaigned for stricter censorship and moral policing. Its lobbying produced the infamous Criminal Law Amendment Act, the same legislation that criminalized homosexual acts and raised the age of consent for girls from 13 to 16. The law's contradictions captured the essence of Victorian morality. It sought to protect purity through punishment, to enforce virtue through surveillance. Yet censorship could no longer stem the tide. The debates themselves transformed public consciousness. The fact that women could stand on public platforms and discuss birth control, marriage, and sexual ethics was revolutionary. Pamphlets once hidden in drawers became the subjects of parliamentary inquiry. Even the churches, sensing the shifting wind, began to speak of companionate marriage and mutual love. What had begun as whispers in the drawing room became a public conversation that no amount of prudery could suppress. By the 1890s and early 1900s, the word Victorian itself was becoming a synonym for hypocrisy. Young writers and artists, the decadents and the aesthetes, turned rebellion into style. Figures like Oscar Wilde, Aubrey Beardsley, and the poet Renée Vivian celebrated beauty, artifice, and sensuality as acts of resistance against the drab morality of the bourgeoisie. In their salons and journals, eroticism was not hidden but aestheticized, transformed from scandal into art. Wilde's imprisonment in 1895 may have symbolized the triumph of repression, but his legacy ensured its eventual defeat. His defiance gave a human face to the struggle for authenticity in love and art alike. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, the moral empire she had personified began to unravel. The Edwardian years that followed saw the birth of the modern sexual world, psychoanalysis, suffrage, and the first family planning clinics. But none of this would have been possible without the quiet courage of those Victorian reformers who dared to speak unspeakable truths. They had shown that morality was not immutable, that law could change, and that desire, once liberated from guilt, could be a source of dignity rather than shame. The sexual revolution of the 20th century did not begin in the 1960s. Its first sparks were lit in the gaslight of the 19th. Each lecture, pamphlet, and protest chipped away at a centuries-old edifice of silence. The rebels of the Victorian age, Butler, Besant, Ellis, Carpenter, and countless unnamed others, taught the world that purity without freedom is tyranny, and that the body, once reclaimed, can become a site not of sin, but of truth. When Queen Victoria died in January 1901, the official narrative was one of triumph, an empire at its zenith, a people united by faith, industry, and moral rectitude. But beneath the black crepe and funeral hymns lay the remnants of an age that had spent nearly a century at war with its own instincts. The Victorian era did not end with the Queen's death. It lingered like perfume trapped in fabric, haunting the generations that followed. For all its prudery and repression, it had created something profound. The modern consciousness of sex itself. The cracks in the moral facade had been widening for decades. The public scandals of the 1880s and 1890s, the Cleveland Street male brothel affair, the Oscar Wilde trials, the debates over prostitution and contraception, forced Victorians to confront what they had long denied, that sexuality was not a shameful aberration, but a central force in human life. When those repressed truths finally surfaced, they did so explosively, reshaping art, medicine, and politics alike. The first to make sense of this upheaval were the new psychologists of the fin de siècle. Sigmund Freud, an Austrian observer of the Victorian world's anxieties, distilled its neuroses into theory. His concept of repression, that forbidden desires are buried in the unconscious only to return as dreams, slips, or symptoms, was the logical conclusion of a century of silence. Victorian morality had produced the very pathologies it claimed to cure. The governess who fainted, the hysterical wife, the melancholic clergyman, all became case studies in the human cost of moral denial. Freud's 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905, exploded the myth of innocence. He argued that sexual energy was present from infancy, that normality was an illusion, and that civilization itself was built on the repression of instinct. Though his language scandalized the Edwardian press, his ideas found eager readers among those who had grown weary of hypocrisy. The Victorian attempt to suppress desire had, ironically, given birth to the science that revealed its universality. In trying to silence the body, the 19th century had taught the 20th how to listen to it. The medical and moral battles of the Victorian age left a complicated legacy. Doctors like Havelock Ellis and Marie Stopes carried the torch of reform into the new century, transforming taboo into education. Stopes' 1918 book, Married Love, sold hundreds of thousands of copies, offering practical advice on intimacy and contraception, ideas unthinkable under Victoria. For many couples, it was the first time sex had been described as mutual, emotional, and healthy, rather than sinful or dangerous. Ellis' advocacy for same-sex love, though still controversial, laid the foundation for later movements of sexual rights. Even the laws born of Victorian prudery began to erode. Censorship waned, divorce became accessible, and public health replaced moral policing. Yet, the shadow of the past remained. Every debate about obscenity, homosexuality, or family values in the 20th century echoed Victorian arguments in new form. The categories invented by 19th century science, the normal, the perverse, the inverted, continued to shape social thought long after the era that birthed them had faded. Culturally, the Victorian preoccupation with restraint left a lasting imprint. Modernism, the artistic movement that defined the early 20th century, was in many ways a rebellion against Victorian moral and aesthetic rigidity. Writers like D.H. Lawrence, Virginia Woolf, and E.M. Forster grappled with the psychological scars of repression. In Lady Chatterley's Lover, Lawrence turned passion into a spiritual force that could heal the industrial soul. Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway and Orlando explored gender fluidity and same-sex desire with a subtlety unimaginable in earlier fiction. Forster's Maurice, written in 1913 but unpublished until 1971, dared to depict a homosexual relationship with tenderness and dignity, a direct rebuttal to the moral terror that had destroyed Oscar Wilde. The visual arts followed a similar path. Where Victorian painters had hidden sensuality beneath allegory, the new century's artists, from Egon Schiele to the Bloomsbury Group, embraced the naked body as a symbol of truth. Photography, once a tool of ethnographic voyeurism, became an art of self-expression. The very technologies that had served repression now documented liberation. The feminist legacy of the Victorian reformers also bore fruit. By 1918, women in Britain had won the right to vote, and by 1928, equality in suffrage. But the deeper struggle for control over reproduction and sexuality continued. The birth control movement, led by Stopes and later by Margaret Sanger, was both an heir to and a rebellion against Victorian paternalism. Where moralists had sought to discipline the female body, these reformers sought to free it. The voluntary motherhood, envisioned by Annie Besant, became, within a generation, a global conversation about bodily autonomy. The early 20th century also saw the emergence of homosexual and trans identities as political realities rather than medical curiosities. The groundwork laid by 19th century sexologists allowed activists in the 1920s and beyond to claim a lineage, to say for the first time that difference was not deviance. Though persecution persisted, the language of pathology slowly gave way to that of rights. In this sense, the Victorians had done the unintentional work of revolutionaries. By naming desire, they made it speakable. And yet, the Victorian moral imagination never truly died. It lingers in every culture war, every public panic about obscenity, every tension between privacy and propriety. The architecture of repression, the division between public virtue and private vice, remains a defining feature of Western society. From debates over censorship to anxieties about gender and identity, the ghost of the 19th century still haunts us. Its contradictions, purity and passion, control and curiosity, continue to shape our own. To understand the Victorians is to understand ourselves. Their fear of desire was not unique to their century. It was the human fear of losing control. Their hypocrisy was the shadow cast by idealism, their prudery the mask of longing. They were not merely repressed. They were obsessed, tormented and fascinated by the very impulses they denied. And in that struggle, they revealed something timeless. That sexuality, far from being a corruption of civilization, is one of its engines. It drives art, faith, rebellion and tenderness, the very forces that make us human. When historians sift through the letters, diaries and medical treatises of the 19th century, they do not find a monolith of repression, but a dialogue between duty and desire, sin and science, silence and speech. The Victorians did not invent hypocrisy, they perfected it. But they also laid the groundwork for its undoing. The freedoms of the modern world, to love without permission, to speak without shame, to question authority, were forged in the crucible of their contradictions. In the end, the shocking sexual practices of the Victorian era were not merely acts of indulgence or rebellion. They were expressions of humanity pushing against the iron bars of its own making. The lace curtains of propriety, meant to conceal, became translucent. Through them the world glimpsed its reflection, flawed, desiring, and at last awake.